As discussed in previous modules, the RIA Manual provides for different analytical tools that can help better assess options. Additionally, the RIA Manual also lays out different analytical lenses which may be applied as necessary depending on your regulation's context and scope. In this module, we'll look at the 4 lenses provided in the manual, which include competition impact assessment, gender and social inclusion impact assessment, environmental assessment, and disaster risk impact assessment. First, we have competition impact assessment, or CIA, which looks at the impact of the proposed regulation on competition in markets. OECD has indicated that some regulations can reduce competition in markets. This is detrimental to consumers and society in general when potential competitors are deterred from entering the market because of regulatory rules that are difficult to comply with. A proposed regulation is likely to restrict competition if it limits the number of firms in the industry, and businesses are restricted in their ability to choose the price, quality, range, or location of their products. The use of CIA is highlighted in both APEC and OECD economies since it helps identify possible anti-competitive regulations from being implemented. By looking at possible market impacts, we can ensure that regulations promote competition and ultimately improve the economy by providing consumers with easier access to goods and services and allowing firms to enter the market and improve its ability to provide quality goods and services. The second lens is Gender and Social Inclusion Impact Assessment, or GISIA, which ensures that proposed regulations are consistent with gender mainstreaming and the national strategy of the Philippine Government to promote the twin goals of gender equality and women's empowerment. GISIA looks at 2 key elements. First is on gender. Does a regulatory proposal reduce, maintain, or increase the gender equality between women and men? And second is on social inclusion. Does a regulatory proposal reduce, maintain, or increase the inequalities and vulnerabilities of socially excluded groups, such as persons with disabilities, indigenous groups, and the economically disenfranchised? GISIA emphasizes the need for regulatory proposal to consider a whole-of-society approach and to take into consideration possible impacts to women and other marginalized groups. Third lens is environmental assessment, which focuses on the balance between socioeconomic development and environmental conservation and protection to ensure sustainable development for both present and future generations. Regulations that will likely cause negative or irreversible impact to the environment should be carefully evaluated before they get approved and implemented. Regulations that have been assessed using an environmental lens may also help in preventing the implementation of unnecessary programs or projects arising from the proposed or existing regulation. The integration of environmental assessment into the RIA process varies from one country to another. The variation reflects both the complexity and peculiarity of environmental conditions in a specific country or area and the challenges to integration. There are 2 basic factors at work. First, it is almost impossible to predict future impacts on complex systems such as the natural resources and environment. Second, there is a need to consider different institutional and organizational stakeholders that have conflicting interests over the environment. Lastly, we have the Disaster Risk Impact Assessment, or DRIA. According to the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Philippines loses about 7.5% of its gross savings from multiple hazards every year. Hence, the need to look into how regulation will impact the achievement of disaster risk reduction objectives is paramount, since disasters and bad development policies, including bad regulations, are closely interlinked. The Philippines has long stressed the importance of disaster risk reduction and climate change even long before the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. This can be observed through the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010 and the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022. It is therefore important to assess the impact of new and existing regulations on DRR efforts. Generally, a regulation should not be allowed to proceed if it would increase exposure and vulnerability of people and assets to disaster risks, influence or trigger the occurrence of natural hazards, or limit the capacity of communities and institutions to deal with impacts of disasters. As a review, the 4 lenses provided in the RIA Manual include competition impact assessment, which looks at possible market impacts and ensure the promotion of competition. Gender and social inclusion impact assessment, which emphasizes a whole-of-society approach in the consideration of impacts specifically on women and marginalized groups. Environmental assessment, which focuses on the balance between socioeconomic objectives and environmental conservation. And lastly, disaster risk impact assessment, which looks into the achievement of disaster risk reduction objectives. The application of different analytical lenses on top of your analytical tools can help your agency better understand the different impacts of your proposed regulations and help decision makers and stakeholders have a better understanding of the scope and context of the policy problem and the rationale for intervention. In the next module, we'll go over monitoring and evaluation and how it is essential in the RIA process to ensure coherence and maintain quality.